So we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon session titled Becoming a More Student-Ready, First-Gen Student-Ready College Campus. Again, my name is Elizabeth Manuel, and if you had joined us in the plenary session, you were able to hear from Dr. Ardwin. And so she's just a little bit more about her background. She is from a rural town in Louisiana, and she's a first-generation college student. She does hold a BS in secondary education from LSU and an MS in higher education and student affairs from Florida State, and then her PhD is in educational research and policy and analysis from North Carolina State. Her research interests include social class identity in higher education, college access and success, particular for first-generation college students and students from rural areas. Also, students and women's leadership development and practice, and career preparation and pathways in higher education and student affairs. We mentioned earlier that she has co-authored 4 books, and she serves as a speaker and consultant across the country. Please join me in welcoming again Dr. Sonja Ardwin.
Thank you again, Elizabeth. I really appreciate it. Thanks to those of you who are joining us this afternoon. Whether or not you were in the other session, hopefully this session will give you sort of some scalable practices or things to think about as you sort of prepare to welcome first-generation college students to your campus. They're already there, but maybe thinking a little bit more intentionally about how to serve and support and retain those students to completion of the certificate or degree that they are seeking during their time with you. So this session is sort of predicated off of a book, the concept, a book on becoming a more student-ready campus by Dr. Tia Brown McNair and her colleagues at the American Association of Colleges and Universities, or AAC&U. Dr. Brown McNair and her colleagues have done some amazing work around this. It's a phenomenal book I want to recommend as well. They're actually going to do a new version of that book soon, so if you want to wait for the new version. But that's sort of where this concept comes from, is that we don't necessarily, I think for a long time in higher education, we have said, well, the students aren't ready, right? They're not academically ready, or they weren't socially ready, or, they're not financially ready sort of for this commitment of pursuing higher education. And this concept really flips that script and says, actually, if we're admitting students to our campuses, we should be ready for them versus assuming that they are ready for us, that they have to sort of bend and mold to our sort of, in some ways, archaic systems. But it is saying, we will be prepared and ready to help and support and graduate or complete, help students complete the certificate or degree they're coming to seek with us. That it's our responsibility to sort of see them through that process. It's not just their own sort of individual responsibility. So that's really sort of where this concept comes from. What I want to offer this afternoon is sort of this 5-step process to becoming a more first-gen college student-ready campus. And so this concept of knowing your students, which sounds easy, but yet is not simple. Recognizing the barriers we have created. Again, like I mentioned, I think as institutions and folks who work at those institutions, we have created the barriers, right? The students didn't create the barriers, and we have created them. And how do we reduce or eliminate some of those would be the third part of this. How do we implement new support structures? And then how do we continue learning about first-gen college student experiences so that we can do more of 1 through 4 as well. This concept of knowing the students on your campus really has sort of derived from the work of some of the Lumina Foundation. I'm actually in Indianapolis right now, and so the Lumina Foundation is sort of around the corner here from where I currently am situated. We may think, well, I know the students on my campus, right? I've looked at the demographic population stats from our admissions office, our institutional research office, or, we have student employees who work in our office. I know some students. And so we may think that's true, but if we work on a campus, whether it's a campus of 500 or a campus of 50,000, do we know actually the experience students are having with our systems and processes and campus culture and some of those sort of pieces? And so really thinking about how do we get to know and understand the unique student experiences on our campus. I mentioned in the plenary session that there are multiple ways to define first-generation college student. These are 2 opposing, actually, federal definitions. So the National Center for Ed Statistics, and this is an older definition, but they still use a version of this, is that first-generation college students are students who are the first in their family to pursue education beyond high school. And if we sort of dissect this definition, what we will find is that there's some confusing terminology here. What does first in the family mean? There are a number of students who say, well, I'm not first because my sibling is currently enrolled, or my caregiver is enrolled at the same time I'm enrolled. And so I'm not first because technically this person who has cared for me is also concurrently enrolled, or my sibling was older than me, or those sorts of things. When in reality, both of the siblings, all of the siblings would be considered first generation college students. But it depends how literally someone, an individual or an institution takes the word first. Pursue education beyond high school would literally mean anything post-secondary education. So if somebody enrolled in one sort of certificate course that was like a 30-hour course, then a student wouldn't be considered a first generation college student. Or if their caregiver enrolled for a class but then stopped out after 2 weeks, that student wouldn't be a first generation college student. So that piece on pursuit is really in some ways knocks out a bunch of students who could be served by being identified as first generation college students. So, and that definition is in sort of contrast to the definition that's used by federal TRIO programs, which is also the most common definition from the Center for First Generation Student Successes sort of analyses, which is neither parent or caregiver or guardian, whatever word we want to use there, has earned a 4-year college degree. And that is generally the more broad definition. That is the one that more institutions are using because it essentially says that unless your caregiver has earned that 4-year credential, there's still a lot to the process of pursuing and completing higher education that may be new to you. And so the challenge here is that if we're comparing data that we've collected under the TRIO definition to National Center for Ed Statistics data, we're not comparing the same thing. And so the NCES definition is much narrower than the other federal definition, which is TRIO programs, which is a federally funded sort of support program for first generation college students, students of color, et cetera. So we don't agree on the campus-based level. We don't agree on the federal level, which makes some data comparisons hard. My sort of take in this is that we should be using the broadest definition possible in order to best prepare to serve students who are newer to the higher education landscape. This was I was mentioning before. I also shared this in the plenary, is around the different definitions campuses are using. Again, you'll see that 56%, the longest bar graph there, aligns with the TRIO federal definitions that are being used, as opposed to you know, the 8% definition there, which is more aligned with the National Center for Ed Statistics definition. So again, like I mentioned, 36% of undergraduate students are identified as or identify themselves as first generation college students. Again, I would offer that that's sort of a general number nationally. And so thinking about, in some ways it's a low estimate because it may or may not be counting international students, students who sort of come to higher education from different sort of circumstances and dynamics. So some would argue it's a lower estimate, but we know at least 1/3 of undergraduate students are coming from first generation sort of college student families. And we know that this number is higher based on institutional type. So if you're at a community college, some small private institutions that are more accept more of their applicants, as well as some regional public institutions, and even some broader sort of research 4-year institutions are having higher numbers of first generation college students based on their location, based on the state they're in, some of those pieces as well. So we talked about this in the plenary, but I would encourage you, if you don't know the number of first generation college students on your campus, to contact your institutional research office and or your admissions office, or both of those offices, to see if they have that number, because knowing how many students can help you advocate for resources on your campus, can help you create some support structures and systems. And so if you're like, I have no idea if we have that data on my campus, that's the number one thing I would encourage you to do, because if we don't know how many first generation college students are there, we can't necessarily serve them well. So thinking about getting to know your students is also getting to know some of the data, if it's available, around those students, but also when you meet those students, asking them their own stories and understanding sort of the nuance and dynamic to their individual experiences as first generation college students on your campus. We know that we know that some of our students get left out. So if you have a student you're working with that's like, I'm not first gen because my sibling enrolled before I did, trying to help them understand that, again, all siblings that are from that family are likely first generation college students, unless perhaps they share different caregivers or parents or things of that nature. international students. So if you are working with international students, if your definition doesn't include sort of a 4-year degree in the US, how are we going to serve international students? Because our system of higher education in the United States is very different than in other countries. And so even if somebody's caregivers have earned a degree in Africa or Australia or England, the system that they are currently navigating in the US is very different than that. And so how are we serving those international students who are the inaugural person in their family to seek a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree in the United States? And then how does this also play for students who are formerly in the foster care system? And so depending on our definition, are we counting those students as independent students? Are we counting them as sort of the education of their last foster family? Like, what does all of that look like for students who are formerly in foster care, as well as students who are perhaps estranged from their family? So maybe they are not formally independent in the legal sense, but they are not receiving sort of support from their families for a whole host of different reasons. And so how are we also supporting those students who may not be captured again in the formal definition your campus may be using, but may still need to be served because they are experiencing higher education as sort of the first person in their family or unit, conglomeration of people to be able to have that experience. So that's about getting to know the students on your campus. Once we get to know students, how do we recognize the barriers that we've created for first-generation college students in higher education broadly, but also on our campuses more specifically? So as we think about common hurdles, I can't see the chat box, so maybe Elizabeth can help me in this. I'm going to encourage you to put things in the chat box that you believe are common hurdles that first-generation college students may face on your particular campus. So if it's a community technical college, if it's a 2-year community college where they're earning associate's degrees, if it is a 4-year institution, again, knowing that first-generation college students have different experiences, but sort of overarchingly, are there things that you have noticed in your work that are impacting first-generation college students' ability to access and or navigate higher education? So I'll wait for about a minute to see if folks have thoughts in the chat box, if Elizabeth can share those with me if they are. I
certainly can. Yeah. Affordability beyond the West Virginia Promise, which is our state-based Promise Scholarship.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes, finances are huge.
What are some other barriers or challenges that you all are seeing?
Anything else come to mind from your sort of vantage point in the work that you do? Or your own experiences if you identify as a first-generation college student?
Not knowing what to expect and understanding what is expected from a college student.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, absolutely. So this concept of like expectations, college knowledge, absolutely.
Language barriers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and language in a lot of ways. It could be language in terms of sort of jargon, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. It could be literal language if you are a bilingual or multilingual individual. It could be accents, dialects, all kinds of ways. Absolutely.
And this one is just so true. Not understanding college terminology, examples given, bursar's office, credit hour, etc. And then the transitions from the admissions office to student success and transition offices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk more about jargon in a second, and I'll try not to get on my soapbox. I do some research around sort of jargon and acronyms and language, but also, which office do I call for stuff, right? Or after I'm admitted, who do I go to next? And so, we have a lot of, the bigger our institution, perhaps the more we have, but even at smaller institutions, we have multiple offices. And so do students know where to go for what? Or how do we do those handoffs from our office to another office? Absolutely.
And Sonia mentions classism, getting past the idea that you don't belong.
Yes, absolutely. So for freshman students who are coming from poor and working class backgrounds, all the ways institutionally, we have created sort of classism and students accessing different things. I think about that a lot as a faculty member in terms of course materials. And it's sort of been my commitment as I've come into a faculty role that I will assign nothing in terms of course materials that's not available in our campus library, so that students can access that at no additional cost, sort of to them personally, because they're already paying the library fee. So absolutely, thank y'all for those sort of comments and thoughts. Some of the ones that often come up in the literature, first and foremost, is that we have to, and this is from a book by Husell and Harvey, stop expecting first-generation college students to negotiate the academy's demands and help them do so. So not making assumption that they should know that, or they know what office to go to, or we put it on the website so they should know. And so how do we take a more sort of active role in helping students navigate the systems that we have in place? Because it's us who put the system there. And you may say, well, it wasn't me. I just started working here a year ago. We're still part of the system. And so how do we understand that we have created the barriers? The student didn't create the barrier, we did. And so how do we help them figure out how to navigate some of those things, or how do we reduce that so they don't have to navigate it? The literature talks about sort of these 5 common challenge. One, so the folks who are speaking about jargon and acronyms and things like that, the literature calls it college knowledge. Some people would call it the hidden curriculum, but it's all the language and ways and processes and systems that we have in higher education. Knowing how to register for classes, knowing how to get your financial aid, knowing how to, where to go for perhaps if there are counseling services on your campus, knowing how to go and talk to a professor. All of those sorts of pieces to the puzzle can be really complicated for first-generation college students. This second sort of bubble there in the middle is around support networks. So do students feel like they have support from their family and or home community? Do they feel like they have the support of other of their peers? How are they finding their interactions with administrators, staff, faculty on campus? And so really thinking about how do we help students get connected to the campus community, to one another, all of those sorts of pieces. Time constraints tend to be really present for first generation college students. And so if they are working one or multiple jobs, if they are in caregiver roles, all of those things tend to show up. Particularly, we may have students who are first gen who are working 40 hours a week, and then that reduces the slots of courses they can enroll in. It also reduces their ability or makes it complicated for them to get engaged in campus involvement. So clubs and organizations, campus recreation, you have that on your campus, all of those different sorts of pieces. And also the time that we are open in our offices. So if we are only open in our offices as academic advisors or people who work in financial aid or the registrar's office from 8 to 5, but a student works from 8 to 5 in their jobs, then how are they ever going to receive our resources? And so we really sometimes have a time challenge. And one of the things I have suggested there sometimes is for people to flex their office hours. And so you have some staff members work from traditional 8 to 5, some work for 9 to 6, some work from 10 to 7. And I know that gets complicated sort of from a logistical standpoint, but if we truly are wanting to be prepared for and serve first generation college students, how do we think differently about the hours we're engaging in work that students may not have availability during those hours? Sort of what I spoke about in the plenary is next, which is really sort of these identity layers that first generation college students bring. So their race, their ethnicity, their age, their religion, their sexuality, their social class, and how does that differentiate their first generation college student experience from other students who may also identify as first generation college students. And then the final piece is what I talked about in the plenary as well, which is around dual alienation. So this combination of imposter syndrome and traitor syndrome, making you feel like I don't really belong in higher education. It wasn't necessarily made for me from the get-go. And by going to higher education, it also created some costs for me in my family or home community. And so therefore, I sort of fit in both places, but really don't fit in either place, and sort of have this feeling of being bifurcated in my life experience that sometimes, I feel like I'm good in higher ed and sometimes I don't. Sometimes I feel good at home and sometimes I don't. And so I think it's interesting because nobody ever sat me down as a first generation college student and said, here are some of the costs, not literal, but figurative, of pursuing higher education. Everybody always said, it's going to be great for you. It's good. We're so proud of you. Go, go, go. And nobody ever said, oh, you earn these 1, 2, 3, however many degrees you might earn or certificates or things like that. And here are the ways it may compromise your relationship with your family. Here are the ways it may mean that you can never move back to your home community because what you've chosen to sort of study and pursue in terms of your career is not available there. And so I don't think I always sort of understood those things. And nobody definitely sat me down and said, hey, here are all the things you might be giving up by pursuing these things. It was always seen as a value add and has been an extreme value add for me in my life. I didn't know that I was always agreeing to the things that I was giving up, if that makes any sense to folks. So those are some of the sort of challenges and barriers that exist more commonly in the literature for first generation college students. So then I want us to sort of think about how do we reduce or eliminate those barriers? We know they exist. Again, I would argue that it is our responsibility to reduce and eliminate those barriers. So sort of what do we do? First, I want to offer us some questions to consider. So feel free to screenshot this or save these questions in ways that you can bring them back to the teams that you are working in or the institutions that you work in. But that first question goes back to that first point I was making earlier about who are the first generation college students attending our institution. So not only the pure number, but then can you disaggregate that number? So if you say we have 42% of students on our campus who are first generation college students, how many of those students, what does that breakdown look like by race and ethnicity? What does that breakdown look like around gender? What does that breakdown look like around social class? What does it look like around age, right? And so really starting to look at sort of the nuance of that first generation college student population that's on your campus. So learning who those students are, if they are working with you or volunteering in the office through a student group that is associated with your office, can you also ask those students about their experience? Like what has been a challenge for you at this institution? You can do that formally, sort of through focus groups or feedback groups, and perhaps offer some perks for students who are willing to give you that feedback, or you can just do it informally as well. But sort of matching that quantitative piece of the data, the stats, to that qualitative piece of students sharing about what those barriers and challenges may have been for them, or things that have been awesome and great and smooth for them. And so also knowing what you're doing well in terms of how you have are serving first generation college students and the barriers you may have already reduced for them. Thinking about how do we want those students to grow and develop while they're with us? And so we may be thinking about this more broadly for all students when we think about sort of learning intentions or learning outcomes that we're hoping, whether it's for an individual course we may be teaching or a broader office we may be working in. And so really trying to think about that and centering the first gen experience, because if we center that first gen experience, we are probably also serving continuing generation students as well. And so how do we hope they learn and grow while they're with us? So that there may be very specific things that we're hoping for, and there may be sort of more overarching things as well. But do we know how we hope they grow and develop while they're with us? And what does that look like? And then once we sort of have set those learning intentions or outcomes, what learning experiences do we currently have or could we create to get students to that growth and development? So for example, if we had a learning intention that, if I worked in financial aid, maybe I have a learning intention that students will have some measure of financial understanding, financial literacy after their interaction with the Office of Financial Aid, right? So if that's my learning intention, what experience exists, right? So maybe when students meet with a financial aid officer, there are specific experiences or conversations that we have with that student that gets to that learning intention or outcome of having financial literacy after some measure of financial literacy after interacting with our office. And so maybe that looks different if you're an academic advisor. Maybe your learning intention is that students are assured of their next step in their academic path. Well, what experience can you create? Again, maybe it was an advising conversation with you. Maybe it was a task during your advising meeting that they've completed that gets them to that learning intention. So linking how we hope they grow with sort of how we're interacting with students in the spaces that we occupy on our campuses. And then what do they need from us to succeed? Sometimes I feel like I feel like, oh, I was a first generation college student. Like I sort of know maybe what first generation college students need. And that's probably true to some degree. But I was an undergraduate student 21 years ago. So do I really know what today's first generation college students need? I would offer, I've read enough literature, I do research maybe, but asking sort of them what they need and what is helpful to help them succeed, I think is important in that conversation. Again, you can do that formally or informally with students. And then how do we know when learning and growth has happened? And so thinking about sort of our assessment measures that we could be using or are currently using to sort of affirm, right, that we know those learning experiences got students to those specific learning intentions or outcomes we were hoping from their interaction with our office or unit on the campus. So these are sort of, in some ways, philosophical questions, but I would also offer them as practical questions because it sort of leads us through this strategic process of thinking about how we can reduce or eliminate some of these barriers that first generation college students are experiencing in higher education. Jargon. We have mentioned this a couple of times already in this session, but I wanted to specifically spend some time drawing attention to how jargon and acronyms and terminology in higher education can be a pretty significant barrier for students. And again, I would offer this as a simple but not, or easy but not simple way of reducing barriers. And so I think about this, I did some research in terms of college access, looking at materials that colleges and universities sent out to prospective students and how much jargon was in it. And it was a ton. In some cases, if it was an email, there may have been 1 or 2 pieces of jargon in terms of how I analyze these documents. In other sort of brochures that were sent out, it had been like 20, 30 pieces of jargon that were not defined or explained anywhere in the materials. And so we're sending out all these materials thinking, I'm giving all this great information to prospective students or current students, when in reality, we're sending a bunch of information that is not consumable to those specific populations. And some institutions have started to do some interesting sort of pieces around this, which I'll share. So people are starting to pay more attention to this, but I think it can be really challenging for folks, because if you worked in higher ed for 20 years like I have, you are sort of swimming in the water of the jargon, and you don't even realize how much of it you're using, whether it's in conversations, in emails, and formal publications. And so how do we sort of look at it with fresh eyes and say, oh my gosh, yes, we have this policy we send to students and it's not consumable because we've used 15 pieces of jargon that we never have defined or explained to those students. So really starting to dissect some of this, I think, is important. And it's a time intensive, but not financially sort of costly way to think about reducing barriers. So I want to give you 2 illustrations, one sort of from the classroom perspective and one from the sort of co-curricular perspective. So we're seeing it sort of from multiple lenses in the institution, depending on how you are situated in your work. So this first illustration, and I'll read it in case folks, it's too small on your screens, but it says, you are a first-generation college student who is in your first semester at WVCC. I don't think that's a real institution. I hope it's not. If it is, I apologize. You have just been assigned a faculty advisor who you're expected to see before registration. They tell you to see them in open office hours about a financial hold on your merit-based scholarship and to bring ideas for your gen ed courses, consider the service learning requirement, and prepare prerequisite questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is in the chat box, and if Elizabeth, if you can help me out here again, but I want you to throw in any terms in this little blurb or paragraph here that you would consider jargon. So if you want to type in anything, any words, phrases, etc., that you see in this paragraph that you'd be like, oh yes, that was jargon if I was doing a jargon audit.
Gen ed.
Yes, gen ed, right? Again, if you work in academic advising or you work in curriculum or that may be something you talk about all the time, the gen ed curriculum. And people are like, students may be like, what are you talking about, the gen ed curriculum? I thought I was going to get a degree in, whatever it might be, right? Nursing. So why am I doing general education? I want nursing. Absolutely. That's definitely one.
Prerequisite and service learning.
Yes, absolutely. So prerequisite, we again say that all the time, right? Oh, well, that's a prereq for that. What does that mean, right? So that's not a word that we necessarily encounter in general life. And so, but we use it a lot in higher education. And it doesn't always make sense to students. Like, you can't take that class, it's a prereq. Maybe then they'll Google it, but absolutely. Service learning as well, right? You may know that, the AAC&U says service learning is a high impact practice. Again, all that's a lot of jargon. And so telling a student they have a service learning requirement, they may not know what that means.
And merit-based, but then here's one that can be a scary one for a student: financial hold.
Yes, absolutely, right? So if you receive this information as a student, you may not know the difference between a need-based scholarship and a merit-based scholarship, but you see that word financial hold, you might as well have put it in neon lights flashing, right? So a student sees financial hold and thinks, oh, my money's gone. It's doesn't even pay to go see my advisor because they're, I'm out. And then you may never see that student again based on this one email you might have sent them. So absolutely, that's a very scary term. It would have been for me as an undergrad. It's still for me if I would see that in an email about my life. So absolutely, financial hold is one.
And another one here is experience with students asking what a faculty advisor is.
Yes, absolutely, right? So our distinction sometimes in higher education of a faculty advisor versus like a professional academic advisor versus some other type of advisor, like a student organization advisor. So some students are just all advisors. You all work for the university. You all give me information, right? And so that distinction, I think, can be confusing for students that they don't know why do I have a faculty advisor? Why don't I have a guidance counselor, an academic advisor, or different kinds of words there as well. Absolutely.
And then finally, registration and even office hours.
Yes, absolutely. So those two as well. In high school, sometimes, depending on the high school you went to, sometimes you didn't have to register for classes. You were just given, here's your class schedule, right? And so this concept of registration and that it happens in certain times and there are certain restrictions and all of those pieces. And then absolutely office hours. And so I've actually changed, I apologize if you're hearing emergency vehicles, but the office hours piece I've changed on my syllabus, which is another there piece of jargon. But instead of saying office hours or this and this, I've changed it to say, do you need or want to chat with me? ? And then I tell students how to do that, right? Because I think office hours can feel like going to the principal's office and that you're in trouble and that you only do it if something is wrong versus saying, hey, you want to have a conversation about anything? Here's how we set up a meeting. And so changing that language may seem insignificant or minimal, but can have a very large impact. So absolutely, you've pointed out all of the jargon there. The second sort of illustration here is more so in the co-curricular or student engagement environment. And so I'll read it again in case you can't see all the words. You are a first-generation college student who is in your first semester. You hear about something called WOW that you missed, and now you feel behind in getting involved. Someone tells you to meet with the RA about opportunities to join NRHH and to check out UREC. A different person shares that they really enjoyed their time in SG. You know there are options, but it seems so challenging to find your place on campus. So again, I will ask you to, in the chat box, pull out some words or phrases there that you think are jargon in this sort of co-curricular space.
It is full of acronyms.
Yes, absolutely it is, right? So in this case, I pulled acronyms I've encountered in my time working in student affairs. WOW could be Weeks of Welcome. NRHH is the National Residence Hall Honorary. UREC is an acronym some people use for University Recreation or sort of a campus recreation, if you have that on your campus. RA would be a resident assistant, which is basically a peer student who works in your residence hall. SG on some campuses is student government, which students may have more familiarity with because they may have had student government in their high school. But yes, all of those acronyms, which again, we sort of use all the time. We talk about go see your RA or get involved with SG or whatever it might be. But a first generation college student may not stop us and say, I don't know what an RA is, right? And so how are we speaking in ways that say, if we say it, can we define it even in our sentence, right? Go see your resident assistant. They're called your RA. And so offering students some of that. Absolutely. Anything else that jumps out for folks? It's mostly the acronyms there.
Most mentioned the acronyms, yes.
Absolutely. And so, I'll tell you, I used to work at UNC Wilmington. And the suite, like the office suite that we worked in, was the Campus Activities and Involvement Center. But people would shorthand would call it CAKE. And for first year students in their first semester, or first gen and first year students in their first semester, sometimes they would literally come to our office and say, they told me to come get cake. And they literally thought they were coming to our office to get cake. And when you have a bunch of first year students come to your office and you're like, sorry, we ain't got no cake. Like, that's not a good way to sort of introduce them to campus involvement when they think they're going to come get free dessert. And there is no free dessert. It was just how people are shorthand talking about a literal office space in the student union. So again, but these are, you may say, well, this kind of stuff is not things people really send, but I would offer you can go back and look at your own emails or look at communications to students or look at web pages, and they are full of sort of both acronyms and jargon on college campuses. And so these can be a very much a deterrent to students from getting engaged on campus. It can be a deterrent in continuing their enrollment because if they're thinking about registration and financial holds, they may just say, no, it's too much for me. And so how can we engage conversationally, engage in written form in ways that reduce or eliminate or explain, at the very least, those pieces of jargon? And campuses have sort of been thinking about this in interesting ways. And so there have been a number of campuses, and the Chronicle of Higher Education did a piece on this, but having almost like dictionaries that people are providing now to students, whether it is as part of their admissions materials, as part of new student orientation, if you're a residential campus and you have residence halls, providing like posters that students can put up, whether it's in the hallways or in their rooms, that explain sort of the most common jargon and acronyms on your campus. Because the challenge with jargon is that there's sort of more broad higher ed jargon in the United States, and then institution by institution there is jargon. So in West Virginia, you can go to Bethany College and it's gonna be different jargon than at Marshall, than at WVU. So that's a challenge, particularly as students make transfer between 2-year and 4-year institutions, or between 4-year and 4-year institutions. And then within an institution, there's jargon based on unit, right? So based on the academic area of study, based on the student affairs unit, based on the different kinds of financial pieces that might show up. Athletics has its own jargon. And so how are we breaking that down for students or explaining it to them? I think these dictionaries are a good measure, because I think if we provide them to every incoming student, then the ones that need it will have it. The ones that don't need it, that's fine. They can not use their poster or handout or website or whatever, however you might sort of disseminate that information. So what I encourage you to do around jargon, again, I say it's simple but not easy, or easy but not simple, one of those two, is to go to your office information, your websites, your policies, your communication channels, any hard copy or online sort of material that you put out, and do a jargon audit. It can also help to trade with another office on campus. So if financial aid wants to trade with the student union, it helps because people are looking at it with fresh eyes and can say, I don't know what this means. And so as you engage in this jargon audit process, it'll bring you sort of new insight into how you may be creating barriers for people to understand your communications and information when maybe that was, you didn't even realize you were doing it. And so I've done that with my syllabi and with colleagues' syllabi. And so I think being able to do some of those jargon audits can be really helpful as a sort of first step in reducing some of those barriers for first generation college students, and frankly, for visitors and new employees and other people who are sort of inaugural to our campus. Other ways to think about implementing new support structures. So, if we know who our students are, if we can be conscious of the barriers, if we can start to reduce or eliminate those barriers, sort of the other piece to this puzzle is around implementing new support structures. And campuses have done this in all kinds of ways. And so I want to have us think about, number one, why would you do that? Why are people implementing new support structures around first generation college student populations? And this is from the Center for Freshman Student Success 4-year landscape analysis. And you can see the primary reason campuses are doing it is for retention. They want to retain these students they have admitted and yielded to their campuses, and they want to retain them between year 1 and year 2, year 2 and above, depending on the degree or credential they're pursuing. And so the number one reason is retention. The secondary reason, not surprisingly, is completion, right? Or attainment of that credential that they are pursuing. So that's why people are implementing new support structures, is to retain and complete students, right? Which helps in all kinds of ways, in terms of institutional financials, in terms of if people are into rankings, like all of those sorts of things. But then you'll see, so those sort of secondary measures around academic performance and sense of belonging and student satisfaction. And so we want to retain them, we want to complete them as our sort of primary mission, which makes sense, right? That's sort of what we're in the business of doing. And we want them to have good academic and sort of co-curricular experiences through performance and sense of belonging and satisfaction. So we do it for them to finish, but we also do it so they have a good experience while they are with us on our campuses. In terms of if people have resources to do these things, you may be saying, well, we don't have the resources to do new support structures. Our colleagues don't necessarily either. And so you'll see that about half of them say they have dedicated both human and financial resources for first generation student success, but then about half don't. They're saying neither. We have neither human or financial resources sort of dedicated to this, or we absolutely don't. Like, that's not, we are not going to get sort of new people or new money. And so we're having to sort of make do with what we have that's already existed. So this may help you lobby for some additional human or financial resources, but know that if you're like, we don't have any resources, how are we supposed to do this? That half of the institutions, at least that were in this landscape analysis, but I would probably argue across the country, also don't. And so we are all sort of trying to make do with what already exists. So here are some recommendations of things that other campuses have done that have worked well in terms of new support structures, or that the literature is speaking about, and those sorts of things. So one is recognizing first-generation college students on campus. And that can look like a whole bunch of different things. I mentioned in the plenary session that November 8th is first-generation college student celebration day. And that can be everything from just putting out flyers on your campus to recognize it. Some people do it via swag, right? So buttons they give to students that they can put on their backpack, or a laptop sticker, or a t-shirt that says, I'm proud to be a first generation college student. Or in the case of sort of faculty and staff, either I'm proud to be a first generation college graduate, or I'm proud to support first gen students, right? If they are not a first gen graduate themselves. And so again, are we recognizing those students? We have to know sort of who they are to recognize them, or we can just ask sort of that question or have it open. We could have sort of tabling in a common space on campus that says, hey, if you're first gen, come get a button, or come get a t-shirt, or whatever it might be there. But making it something that people are proud of and are excited about on our campuses can be a great way just to have a support structure, because then if you have a button on your backpack, I have a button on a backpack. So as I travel and do work in other areas, I meet people in airports and stuff. They're like, oh, I'm a first generation college student too. And so you're already making sort of those connections on campus if there sort of is a visible thing that students and faculty and staff are willing to wear or have on their items, or those sorts of things. Considering and trying to provide basic needs. Again, like I said, we can't assume that a first generation college student is also a poor working class student, but we do know that there is some overlap there. And so Sarah Goldrick-Rab, Claire Cady, and some other folks have been doing great research around basic needs. Actually, Claire Cady and them did a book around sort of food security and food pantries on campus. But as we think about food and housing and sort of mental health supports, I would offer that's a basic need. As we think about academic materials and how students access textbooks and technology, software and hardware, all of those sorts of things, I would offer that's a basic need as well. If you don't have the textbook or the ability to type your paper somewhere, then you're not going to perform well academically. So considering what that looks like, if we can't provide sort of loaner laptops or loaner tablets or other sorts of technology, do we have computer labs that are open 24 hours a day so students can access those at times when they're available to be able to do their academic work and things of that nature? So really thinking about basic needs, not just in food and housing, which are obviously very important, but also in terms of the basic things you need to be able to be academically successful in pursuing your credential. I mentioned earlier with the jargon piece, but sharing information and sort of reducing expectation and not lowering the bar. By no way do I mean that in terms of reducing expectation, but I mean reducing the expectation that students will know it. Just by some magical process, they will know how financial aid works, or they'll know how advising works, or they'll know how switching academic areas of study or majors works, like all of those sorts of things. And so not sharing information or dumbing things down, but explaining things, right? Providing information. And then students could say to us, oh yeah, I know that, right? But not, again, making the assumption that people understand our very convoluted processes that we often have at colleges and universities. How are we partnering with underserved high schools or community centers near us? So as we think about wanting to recruit and admit more first generation college students, are we partnering with local high schools near our campuses or in our counties, or with community centers? I did some work in Kansas with an institution, and we talked about recruiting first gen students, and they said, some high school counselors won't let us into the high school because they had sent us a student, we admitted one of their students from their high school, and that student didn't complete, and now they don't trust us. And I said, okay, I understand that that's a barrier, a challenge for you in terms of admissions and recruitment, but have you tried the community center? Have you tried the barbershop? Have you tried and so thinking about not just the sort of high school to college and university pipeline, but also other sort of parts of the community where you may be able to develop relationships and have more access to potential first generation college students, or just supports for existing first generation college students. How do we serve as campus guides? So I mentioned the pieces around jargon and processes, and so how do we see ourselves and in our roles working in higher education as being a guide for students? We're not necessarily doing things for them or those sorts of things, but I think about the first time I went to an airport and how I didn't know where anything was, right? Or I didn't know how security worked, or I didn't know all of those things. And so I had to, you either have to ask a lot of questions, you have to observe other people, and those are ways we learn, but it would be much easier if somebody would sort of walk us through the process with us. I was doing that this morning with our graduate admissions folks. I was new to the online admission system. And so I was like, hey, can you walk me through this? And so how do we do that with and for students, more so with students in their process? And then also thinking about how do we, again, provide opportunities for them to connect with others who have similar backgrounds? That may be other first-generation college students or graduates. That might be other first-gen students particular to race, particular to sexuality, particular to age, veteran status, all of those sorts of things. But how do we connect them to peers, community, faculty members, et cetera, so that, again, because I think sometimes students look at us as we work at colleges and universities and think they see us in our current form. They don't see the sort of pathways we took to get to being a administrator, a faculty member, et cetera. And so how do we share some of our stories in that process so that we can say, hey, like I was also a first generation college student, or I was also from a rural area, or I'm also somebody who identifies as queer, or whatever it might be, so that we're creating those sort of connection spaces for students to feel like they are represented on their campus, at least with one other person. Some campuses, if you're a residential campus, can create living learning communities. There's seen a number of communities that have done a first generation college student living learning community, which builds that sense of connection because there are other folks living on your same hallway or same building that are also experiencing college as a first generation college student. And so that generally is a self-select process. So I would sign up to be in a first gen living learning community, but that way students are living together and also taking at least one course together in that process. So that has been successful at a number of institutions, as well as specific first year experience courses or university one-on-one courses that are specific to first generation college students. So again, it's self-selecting. Students can say, oh, well, I want to, or I have to take a FYE or a U101 course, but I want to do that with other first generation college students. And so offering that sort of as a specific section of that course for first gen college students. And then also, how are we integrating course content? So for those of you who teach classes of whatever sort, how are we infusing sort of the first gen experience into the curriculum and helping students see real world application? Because sometimes I think students say, well, I'm never going to use this. And so how do we help students see the ways they will use that? I thought about that a lot as a student. I took this geography of the atmosphere course. And I thought, when am I going to ever in my life use geography of the atmosphere? I actually use it all the time because I learned about equinoxes and season changes and all of these other things. And so now I understand sort of how the atmosphere works better and how that impacts climate and weather and all of those things. And so things that at first students may say, I'm never going to use this, and start to see how it applies to larger life, even though it may not apply to their specific career pathway. Thinking about reducing or eliminating costs or doing differential pricing. I mentioned I was in Indianapolis right now. I'm at a meeting with other folks who do work in fraternity and sorority life, and we were just talking at lunch about differential dues. And so while we're talking about that in the fraternity and sorority space, that could also apply to other student groups on campus that have sort of a dues or fee structure that can keep students from being engaged on college campuses. And so the reduce or eliminate costs could be big picture in terms of tuition and fees and those sorts of things, or it could be more so in your sphere of influence, that it might be you charge a fee to do X, Y, or Z, and maybe you don't need to do that. Or could there be differential pricing based on students' capacity to pay? And then some people will say, well, that's not fair. And I would argue there's a difference between fairness and equity. And so I would challenge us to strive to be equitable more so than being fair, because students come to us from different circumstances and with different opportunities. And so therefore, what is fair is not generally equitable. And so how do we strive for that piece on equity? And then another piece, so Laura Rendon is a scholar, Dr. Laura Rendon, and she has this theory of validation, which can be very helpful as we think about how do we sort of, as we get to know students, as we interact with students, as we meet with them, how do we validate their experiences? So if they come to us and say, I had a really challenging time working with X office on campus, that we don't automatically say, well, they didn't mean to say it that way, or, that process is just convoluted, that we say, yes, I bet that was a really hard experience. Tell me more about that. Tell me how we can support you. Or if they say they had a great experience, validating that as well. But how do we engage in this process of validation, believing students when they tell us they're having an experience, whether it was a challenging one or a very wonderful one, and then sort of moving forward with how we support them based on hearing and listening and accepting and validating what they are telling us. So some things I've seen that work on other campuses that may be helpful or scalable to your work on your campuses. I mentioned some of these pieces here around visible markers. The University of California system did sort of these pieces. They did buttons, they did placards that people put outside of their office that said, I'm a first-gen supporter, I'm a first-gen college grad. So some of those pieces can sort of elevate the first-gen conversation on campus, or at least make things visible for students as they walk around buildings and offices and things like that. So that has been pretty popular in sort of the first-gen support space, is doing sort of these visible components. And then also thinking about, how do we tell our stories? And so I mentioned earlier that students sometimes get to see us more so in our, I wouldn't say our finished capacity, because I would argue we're never finished learning and growing, but they get to see us, they get to see me in my late 30s capacity. They didn't see me in my 18-year-old capacity. And so how do we share our stories? One, to humanize the work that we're doing and to humanize ourselves, but also to establish those points of connection and let students know they're not alone. So actually, I'm hoping this video works, but I want to share this video. It's from the University of California system, and it is faculty members sharing parts of their stories and how they have sort of worked with their own first-gen experience, but with students who are now identifying as first-gen as well. So let's see if this will work.
You sort of feel like somebody's going to tap you on your shoulder and say, oh, we made a mistake.
I was afraid to speak out. I was afraid that whatever I said wouldn't be smart enough.
At times I thought of leaving that first semester, that maybe I just, really the first day I almost turned around and left.
You're not sure you're fitting. You're not confident you can make it because you're the first one to do it.
There's people around you with better vocabularies and knowledge backgrounds that I was lacking. And that's difficult.
I'm the daughter of mom and dad who are immigrants from Mexico.
My father worked for Frito-Lay. He delivered chips.
Neither had finished high school, so they weren't, I think, exactly sure what this meant.
Each of my parents were farm kids, and each were very poor.
They grew up in a war-torn country where colleges and universities are a luxury.
I wanted the opportunity to get outside of my neighborhood. I knew I wasn't going to go back without a college degree.
I realized that it matters that I'm here, and that for certain people, my presence and what I bring to this job makes a huge difference.
It's important that we help first-gen students feel more comfortable, because a lot of first-gen students are from underrepresented groups, and those students should not be underrepresented.
It makes it so much easier to fully participate and contribute when you feel that you belong.
I'm grateful that I didn't have parents who had PhDs, and this was all laid out for me so that I could figure things out myself. And I like that better.
So what I would say to a first-gen student, congratulations, because you made it. And so you should be so proud of yourself that you're here.
I've had a wonderful career and a great life, and I would like to make sure that other capable young people who come from first-gen families have the support they need.
We do want to show them how far they can go. I'm very happy to be that person who can accompany one of the students on their way to graduation.
Now I have students who are professors. That's crazy.
I want students to be able to look around the room and see other people like them. But more important than that, I want them to be able to look at the front of the room and see somebody who looks like them.
So I offer that, and you may say, well, we don't have the capacity to make that kind of video on our campus. I hear that, but that's one example. I've also seen other campuses who are doing that via social media channels. They have done that via asking faculty and staff and alumni to send in stories that they then share via a pamphlet or a newsletter or other things like that. And so I think there are multiple ways we can share stories, either in longer or shorter or visual or written snippets that let other students see. I've seen campuses do great poster campaigns where they feature different people on campus, faculty, staff, administrators who are first generation college grads and those sorts of things. And so I do think that story sharing piece, when I watch that video, it always warms my heart because I can sort of see, I try to do that as well. In my introduction, you heard Elizabeth say in both sessions, I'm from Vedrine, Louisiana, don't have a zip code, from a rural area. And so I'm proud of those things. And I share them because I think it helps people connect with you sort of differently than if they only saw the books you wrote or the accomplishments or awards you got or those sorts of things. And then the final piece I want to mention in our time here, and I mentioned this in the plenary as well, but is ways to continue learning. And so these are some books, some the same as the last time I mentioned, but also some new ones. And so some resource recommendations. Again, I've mentioned multiple times the Center for First Generation Student Success. They have great resources that a lot of them are free and accessible to everybody. And so there's great schools you can benchmark or scale with. Their research tab has great sort of brand new research that's happening around first generation college students. It also has good media pieces like from newspapers or things like that as well. Multiple documentaries that you can watch or offer as sort of professional development for your team or office or people on your campus. You can listen to podcasts together. And there are a number of books. I offer a few here, but the one here I want to point out that I mentioned, that I didn't mention in the plenary, was the Harvey and Hussell book that really focuses on faculty and first generation college students and how to sort of bridge some of those gaps between those two different populations that are on our campus. And some of the other books I mentioned earlier, Heinz Hussell has another book around intersections, the brand new book from the Longwell Grices on intersections, and then the book Dr. Martinez and I did around the intersections of class and first generation college student experiences there. In particular, I think the second chapter in that book around undergraduate students, we had 3 undergraduate students who wrote their stories for that chapter. One of those students from Chapman University in California, one from the University of Memphis in Tennessee, and then one from Princeton as well. And so they sort of share their raw stories about what it's like to be a first generation college student in sort of the varying dynamics, the positive, the negative, the hard, the wonderful, and some of all of those pieces as well. So I think we have about 4 minutes left maybe. So any questions I can answer for you about thinking about how to become a more first generation college student ready campus.
Dr. Ardwin, a couple of comments came in that I'd like to share with you and then give you the opportunity to respond to those. And one of those was from Christy, and she said, maybe a good way to support first gen is to approach everything as if all students were first gen, assume nothing. And then Alicia mentioned that parents often say to her that they're not first gen, but things that have changed so much since they attended college.
Yes. Thank you for both those comments. So to the first comment, absolutely, right? So I think centering the first gen experience, similar to how if we center other historically excluded or underserved population experiences can be helpful as well. And so if we center that first gen experience and we create our structures and policies and supports for that population, we will inevitably then be able to serve the broader population of continuing generation students as well. So 100% agree with that sort of framing and conceptualization. I think for the second part, yes, I've heard that as well. And I've also heard it from folks who are like, yes, my caregiver earned their degree, but they earned it while I was in high school, right? And so that, or they earned it as a part-time student, or they went to night school, or all of these other sort of dynamics that would be considered maybe less traditional. Knowing that we really, in some ways, don't have a traditional college experience anymore that's universal. But yes, and so, and some people might say, well, it's not fair, right? It's not fair that we're offering the support to first generation college students and not to continuing gen students. So I think to the first comment, if we did it that way, then it wouldn't have that sort of challenge. But I think, I think there are some arguments that students whose caregivers didn't earn a 4-year degree at all have even less information maybe than the student whose parents earned a degree 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But so it has changed, but it hasn't changed so much that it's almost like they're starting at zero, like first generation college students would be. So I think that is a challenge to try to explain to people, because people always feel like, well, I should also get that support structure. And I'm not saying they shouldn't. Ideally, we would give all students all the supports they needed, but there are some realistic sort of constraints and limitations on that based on human and financial resources. And so helping to explain to people that, yes, it may have changed a lot, and you still have information other people do not have.
Just checking in to see if any questions have come in or any additional comments to share. I think that kind of brings us to the end of our time together, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Dr. Ardwin, thank you for your time and the wealth of knowledge that you bring to the table. We appreciate all that you're doing. I know you had the opportunity to meet with some of our students through the WAVASPA program, as well as through one of our institutions, the Gear Up program, and we appreciated that. So for our next closing plenary session titled Habits of Highly Engaged Students, it's going to be full of energy. So I encourage you, if you can, to join us for that. That's starting here shortly within the minute. We just want to see, we hope that everyone has had a great conference, and we appreciate your attentiveness and the chats and the conversations we've been having. So everyone, thank you and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, y'all.